good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Santa Barbara City Water Commission meeting for December 16th, 2021. I'd like us to call to order. Ms. Becerra, if you would do roll call.
Yes. Commissioner Keller?
Yes.
Commissioner Kenmeyer is absent today. Commissioner Cooney?
Yes.
Chair Davis is absent today, and we have Vice Chair Young acting as chair today.
Okay. Do we have any changes to the agenda?
Right. Vice Chair Young, there are no changes to the agenda.
No changes. Today. Thank you, Mr. Hagmark. All right. Do we have, this is the opportunity for public comment. If there's anybody that wishes to address the commission on an item that is not on our agenda, now is the time to do so. Do we have any requests for public comment? Ms. Becerra or Mr. Hagmark, do we have anything?
Vice Chair Young, we do not have hands raised at this time.
Okay, all right. Let's go to agenda item 5, consent items, approval of our minutes for the November 18th, 2021 meeting. Any comment or changes to that set of minutes? All right. Not seeing any.
I move to approve.
Great. Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay. Madam Clerk, if you would take roll on that motion.
Yes. Commissioner Keller?
Yes.
Commissioner Kenmeyer is absent. Commissioner Cooney?
Yes.
Chair Davis is absent, and Vice Chair Young.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Motion approved. Let's go to item 6A, which is our water supply update. Mr. Hagmark, do you want to introduce this item for us?
I'd be happy to, Vice Chair Young. Annually, we provide the annual water supply management report, which is a backwards looking report that looks at water year 21, which wrapped up September 30th. And so we'll be going through and looking at exactly what the community used, how we're doing in conservation, how our various supplies look, and also talking just briefly about all the various water supply issues that are out there that we're tracking and actively involved in. We will also be, as of kind of a follow-up from our last meeting, we'll also be checking with the commission on how you would like us to be talking about our water supply projections going forward. So we've, Ms. Corey's got some options for your consideration this time around. But with that, I'll turn this over to Ms. Corey to provide the presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Hagmark. Good morning, Chair Young and Water Commissioners. My name is Dakota Corey, and I'm the Water Supply Analyst for the city. And as Mr. Hagmark explained, I'm going to present our annual Water Supply Management Report for water year 2021. Next slide, please. Just a quick outline of my presentation. We'll be talking about the purpose of the annual water supply management report. Then we'll do a recap on water year 2021. And just a reminder, water years follow a calendar starting in September and ending in October. So water year 2021 started in September 2020 and ended in October 2021. And then we'll look at our water supply outlook, which again is an item that I presented to Water Commission last month, but I have some new graphs for you to look at this month. So we'll look at that. If you can go back, sorry. And then as Mr. Hagmark explained, we'll talk about some of the important water supply planning issues we've been tracking. We're gonna dive deep into groundwater today because one of the points of the annual water supply management report is to make sure that our groundwater basins are not in overdraft. And then I've got a recommendation at the end. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the annual water supply management report is to summarize the water supplies used in water year 2021. So as Mr. Hagmark explained, this is a backwards looking document. We're going to look at what our plan was for water year 2021, then how we matched up with that plan. This is a requirement as state water users. The State Water Project EIR required that we produce a report that shows that our groundwater basins are in good standing each year. So we'll be looking at that pretty in depth at the end of the presentation. And then again, we hope to make findings that the basins are in long-term balance. Next slide, please. So let's look back on water year 2021. Next slide. Starting with precipitation, since that kind of drives everything we do in water supply planning in this region. As you'll probably recall, water year 2021 showed significantly below normal rainfall. So you can see here some percentages of average at key points in our system. So Gibraltar Reservoir, Lake Cachuma, and Santa Barbara. And you can see that rainfall was either half of normal or even less than half of normal for water year 2021. Next slide. This is a graphical representation of rainfall back to 1970. If we are looking at current conditions, we really want to focus on the lower right-hand corner of the slide, where you can see since 2012, we've seen significantly below average rainfall, except for a handful of years. And 2021 was no different. Next slide, please. This is our planned and actual production. And you can see on the left-hand bar how we plan to use our water for water year 2021. And then the right-hand bar is the water use that we actually used in 2021. And so we did plan on using a mixture of desalination, recycled water, Cachuma water, and Gibraltar/Mission Tunnel water to meet our supply needs. And that's exactly what we did. The only difference is that we did use a little bit more water than we planned, about 400 acre feet. Over the course of water year 2021. And some of that extra water came from Cachuma and some of it also came from Gibraltar. We were able to stretch our Gibraltar supplies for quite a while. So we got to use a little bit more Gibraltar water before that source dried up for the season. Next slide, please. This is a graphic that I show probably every presentation that I make, but it's good to keep tabs on. The black line represents production back to 1985. And then on the right-hand side of the graph, you see our projected production from our enhanced urban water management plan. And so the key takeaway here is that since the last drought in the late 80s, early 90s, we've maintained fairly significant production to meet demand. It fell off in the last drought around 2012. So you see that steep drop kind of valleyed out in 2017, and then it slowly started to creep back up since then. And then comparing the black line to the blue line, you can see that we're really tracking very closely to our projected demands from the enhanced urban water management plan. And just a reminder that those demands include assumptions about how we'll rebound coming out of the next drought, which is going to be complicated now that it looks like we're going back into dry conditions. And then also our supply to Montecito Water District beginning in January 2022. Next slide, please. So one of the tools that came out of our enhanced urban water management plan, which was adopted in June 2021, was our adaptive management plan. And this is a tool that staff can use to track both our supplies and our demands and see where we're at in terms of decision points for a new supply. And so you can see the star in the lower left-hand corner of the graphic. That's where we are now. Demands are just around 12,000 acre feet per year. We haven't seen any significant reductions in supply. And so we're tracking ourselves on both of those axes. And as we creep towards phase 2, either because demands have increased or we've seen a reduction in supply, that's when we're going to have to start planning for our next new supply of water. So this is something that we'll continue to track, and obviously we'll bring to Water Commission when we think that we're in the point where we need to start making some decisions about bringing on new supply. Next slide, please. So this is going to be a recap of the water supply outlook presentation that I gave last month. We can jump to the next slide. This is a summary of the findings of that effort. As you know, we always plan very conservatively when we're looking out for our water supply projections. And so based on the results of that effort, what we found is due to prudent planning and water supply management, as well as the community's continued efforts to use our water efficiently, we don't see a water shortage at all for water year 2022, which we're currently in, or through the fall of 2023. We will continue to track winter precipitation this winter. Things can really change dramatically in Santa Barbara, depending on how much rain we get each winter. So staff is tracking winter precipitation. It was exciting to see a big storm this week. And based on what those precipitation results look like in the spring of 2022, we would potentially come back to Water Commission with some recommendations to implement stage 2 water shortage conditions if the winter is tracking to be dry, because we could potentially see a shortage out in water year 2024, and we'd like to get ahead of it and just really be protective of our water supplies. If we do have to enact additional conservation or a stage 2 water shortage condition, that would allow us to stretch our water supplies into the fall, winter of 2025, even if we assume very dry conditions. So again, the key takeaway here is that we plan for continued drought, and that currently we're actually in pretty good shape. We have about 2 years worth of water supply available to us in Lake Cachuma alone, but we're always keeping our eye on continued dry conditions and protecting those supplies so we can stretch them through the drought. Next slide. So this is a favorite graphic that we've discussed a lot here in Water Commission. This is the version that you saw last month. And so just to explain it for those of you who may have not seen it before, this shows our water supply usage back to 2012, which is kind of the start of the last drought. Each color in the bar represents the type of supply we use to meet demands in that year. So you can see purple is recycled, dark blue is Cachuma, light blue is Gibraltar Mission Tunnel. We've got green desal, yellow groundwater, and orange state water. And the height of the bar represents the total demand for that year. And so you can see as we progress through the last drought, the demand dropped sharply in response to water conservation requirements and our community's effort to really use our resources efficiently. You can also see that desal came online. It actually came online in 2017, just for a little bit, and then we had full production in 2018. So you see the green bars start to appear. And so this is really how we've met our demands. And then if you look on the right-hand side of the graph, you see out years, water year 2022, 23, and 24. And this would be our plan to use our water supplies, again, assuming very dry conditions moving forward. So we'd be looking at meeting those demands with a mix of Cachuma water, desalination, and Mission Tunnel inflow, and then potentially a little bit of groundwater in the out years if conditions remain dry. So the conversation around this graph with Water Commission has been, how do we better communicate the conservation efforts that our community has put in response to these historic drought conditions that we've been facing? So I've presented a couple of other options to visually represent this. We can go to the next slide. This is option 2. So what I did here is I looked at our conservation baseline. So you'll recall that throughout most of the last drought, our baseline year was 2013. And then just this year for water year 2021, the state changed our baseline to 2020 demands. And so what you see here is for years 2012 through 2020, there is a gray bar with sort of some specks in it. And that shows all of the conservation that our community achieved compared to the 2013 baseline. And then from 2021 on, it shows conservation and projected conservation against the 2020 baseline. And that's again, with kind of some gray hash marks. So that's one way that we could present that effort and kind of incorporate demand into this graph. And then I have another option. So next slide, please. Here, I took away the conservation bars against the baseline. And instead of looking at the baseline here, which was sort of imposed by the state of 2013 and 2020, what we look at here is projected demands from our urban water management plans. And so you can see the blue line that goes horizontally across the graph. That shows projected demands from both our 2015 Urban Water Management Plan and our 2020 Urban Water Management Plan. Water Commissioner Keller, I see you have a question.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Corey. Can we go back to the previous one? I'm trying to understand the baseline for 2020, and it seems to me that it includes the sales that we're going to have to Montecito, and that's why the baseline goes up. Is that why? I'm trying to understand why the baseline goes up over the years of the 2023.
No, you're exactly right. And so it has to do with the fact that we're selling water to Montecito starting in January 2022. And you'll actually see that in the next slide with the demand line too. So if you can flip forward one slide, you can see that increase there too.
Right, right. That's what made me think that that's what we were seeing before. So I'm just thinking if we should just have the Montecito sales kind of a separate color or bar or whatever, so that it's not confusing the actual conservation, which I think is what we really want to track. No? But just as a thought.
Okay. Yeah, I think I've thought about that a little bit, just to kind of continue that conversation, and we can continue this conversation into the future. The Montecito sales, we could have it have kind of its own color. I think what's tricky with that one is that water sales agreement is based on surplus water from desalination, but in our agreement, we can actually supply them with any type of water that we have available to us. And so when we're looking at a graph that stacks different supplies on top of each other, calling out the Montecito sales as kind of like its own source gets a little bit confusing. But again, we can continue to discuss it.
Yeah, I almost feel like another graphic
might
be helpful that stacked on it, like who the users were, whether it's residential, commercial, or in this case, a water supply agreement. But I think here we're specifically looking at just the supplies, like what are the supplies? Yeah, the sources. So
I think it may be good. Actually, I agree with Mr. Hagmark that it may be more clear if we have one for sources and we see what's happening, and then we see the one for the demand side, and we separate it, and then we understand what's going on, and how we see there the conservation as a reduction of that demand. No? Yeah.
Okay, that's good feedback. Thank you. Any other questions or comments on these graphs before we move on? I imagine this is going to be a continued conversation, but I appreciate all your feedback.
Yeah. A quick other question. It looks like diesel was the largest production was 2019, and then it was a little less in 2020. And then, I think we had some maintenance 2021, and then it continues to be kind of at that level of 2021. Is that the case that we're kind of producing a little less?
Yeah, because when we do these outward projections, we want to be as conservative as possible. We've put some more contingency on the amount of water that we can produce from the desal plant because we have had a couple of operational issues. I would say that the projections we have in here are very conservative. And so far in water year 2022, we're producing more than we've projected, but we just always want to be conservative when we're looking out into the future.
Sure. Understood. Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide then. So now just a quick summary of important water supply planning issues. We can go to the next slide. In the annual water supply management report, there is a detailed summary of each of these issues. And really the point of this slide was just to direct anybody who's interested attention to the fact that we do have all of these issues. So you can see here listed, the first 3 bullets have to do with our Kachuma supply. We're looking at implementing a new Kachuma project state water rights order. We're still awaiting the project's biological opinion, which could change the amount of supply we have available to us from Kachuma. And we're also looking at renewing our contract for the use of Kachuma with the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. With Gibraltar, we're still working on a Warren Act contract for pass-through operations, which is explained in detail in the annual water supply management report. And then on the state water project, there's other several significant issues, including delta conveyance, water contract assignment, and then the legal action currently with the County of Santa Barbara on some of our management strategies with state water. And so the point of this slide is to get you excited about reading the management report, but also to recognize that staff does spend a lot of time protecting the water rights with each of our supplies. And so these are just some of the issues that we're engaging with federal agencies, state agencies, local joint powers authorities to make sure that moving into the future, we're protecting the city's water supplies. And I'm happy to answer any questions about any of these specific issues. Otherwise, I would just direct you to the report, which has a really good summary. And not seeing any comments or questions, we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. Now we're going to talk about 2 projects related to water supply that we're currently implementing, Both of these projects came directly out of recommendations from the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan, which again was adopted by Council in June 2021. And so one of the first projects we're working on is a recycled water market assessment. Recycled water was a hot topic when we were working on the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan. And one of the recommendations that came out of that effort was to assess our remaining recycled water availability and if we can make sure that that's being utilized by customers as long as it's cost effective. So I just worked with a team to select a vendor for the recycled water market assessment. And I'm currently putting together the contract with that selected vendor. We'll be bringing this to Water Commission next month in January. Overall, you know, the issues with recycled water, I included a graphic here on the right, is we're really looking at the water that we can produce at the plant that utilizes or that's left over during peak demand. So you can see in June, July, and August, September, we use the most recycled water, and that's because it's primarily landscape design. And so most water is needed at the height of summer. And you can see the gray dotted line, which is kind of our contingent plant capacity. There's about 150 acre feet left of available recycled water supply that we could potentially be serving new customers. And so that's going to be the purpose of the assessment, to see if it's cost effective to connect some more customers to the system and really utilize this resource. Did want to bring up too that we brought this to Water Commission several months ago. We have a recycled water agreement with La Cumbre Mutual Water Company. And they've been working to hook up to the system, and everything is falling in place, and it's looking like deliveries will start being we'll start delivering water to La Cumbre in the new year. So that project is moving forward, and they're really excited to receive that water. Next slide, please. Another project that came directly out of the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan is a better understanding of drought storage and sustainable yield in our groundwater basins. So the two questions that we're trying to answer is, how much water can we store in our groundwater basins so that we can track it as we use it? And then what's the sustainable yield? So assuming that the basins are healthy and full, what's the amount of groundwater we could use each year beneficially without threatening the sustainability of our supplies? And so this is a project that we're working with USGS on. They have our groundwater model they developed in 2018, and they're going to utilize the model to better define both drought storage and sustainable yield for our basins. And with that, that's going to give us the opportunity to manage our basins better and hopefully produce a groundwater management plan that is either related to the requirements of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act or a lighter version of that. Question, Mr. Keller?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I was thinking whether USGS can look at the use of our creeks during the dry months as a way to recharge our groundwater basins. You know, other places use that a lot, and so that would be an opportunity to maybe try to use some reclaimed, recycled water as a recharge. Just even see the feasibility of it happening when we then have to look at all many other factors, but at least just to understand whether with the model, one gets sufficient recharge that would be useful for maintaining the basins more active.
Okay, yeah, the current scope of work doesn't include that. The model is definitely capable of looking at creek recharge. The creeks are programmed and the infiltration rates are programmed into the model. I know in the past, prior to my time at the city, we did do some creek recharge. Currently, we're exploring ASR injection, so recharge using our wells versus creeks. And it looks like Mr. Hagmark maybe has more to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in theory it sounds wonderful, and it's how our groundwater basins are naturally charged. That the challenges that we've run into in the past is just that you're creating an artificial situation in our creeks, in which our creeks are typically run dry and then they come back. And so by keeping them wet year round, you kind of create a habitat that in theory creates maybe a space for invasives to hang out that they normally wouldn't have, or you created a situation now that in perpetuity we have to continue to provide water to, even if it's not the most beneficial use of water. So happy to explore that and talk about that some more. I don't know if this is the right avenue to do that, but I think in the short term, the ASR actually injecting water through our groundwater wells is probably the most effective way. But I think it's a really good conversation to be having, which is how does water naturally get there, and is that a way? Is there a sustainable or environmentally friendly way we can do that in the future without creating maybe the adverse ramifications of that?
Right. No, I understand. Another option would be to do over irrigation on some landscapes, but that has its own issues. You then start getting some surface runoff and things like that. So I was trying to think creative, and maybe the comparison as to how much you can recharge one way or another, creeks versus ASR, just to see what would you get and what are the implications of each one. And I'm not saying that, you know, one or the other at this point is the better one. I just think it would be good to take a look at both and see what are the implications.
Yeah, I know. I would really appreciate it. You're probably familiar with United Water's efforts down in the Oxnard Plain. They have what used to be historical gravels next to the Santa Clara River, and they use those to recharge the groundwater basin. You know, we've done enough trenching around the city. We know where there's some the Mission Creek wandered all over the place, where you have some historic gravels and sands. The challenge has always been just the cost of that land, and opening up, what I would presumably be several acres of land that you could pond water on and infiltrate in the groundwater basin. I think that would be ideal. I just don't know that it would be cost effective with the cost of land these days.
Well, I understood. Thank you.
And I have a question, if I may. With respect to the recycled water, is it of such a quality that it can be used for either surface or groundwater recharge?
That's something we'd have to study. We did when we did our potable reuse treatment study. We would have to take it to an extra layer of treatment if we wanted to put it back into the ground, just because what you run into is there's a certain, I've read, it's like 3 months duration it has to spend in the ground, and our groundwater basin was so small that there wasn't a way to get it far enough away from our extraction wells. If you're familiar with Orange County, they have a nice spreading basin that's about 25 miles upstream of their wells, so they've got a good buffer there. We just don't have a basin that's that does not provide that kind of flexibility.
So we'd essentially have to clean it up to a further level than we would we wouldn't normally have to if we had a much bigger basin that would give us that retention time.
Yes, I think the state is taking this really conservatively. You'd have to treat it to that advanced level, and then you still have to have that retention time right now. Now those regulations are, currently being reviewed. Maybe there's an opportunity to shorten that, but I think as we talked about in the past, for us so far, it looks to be the best to take it to that advanced treatment and then put it into Laurel so that we get that direct benefit to our water system. But
great.
If I can jump in really quick too, Commissioner Young, I did want to mention that I will be bringing the market assessment contract to Water Commission next month. And one thing I didn't explain in this presentation, but we'll probably go into greater detail next month, is that the whole recycled water market assessment is framed under the understanding that potable reuse is out in the relatively near future, maybe 15, 20 years. And so any investments that we make, say, in piping to new customers under the recycled water market assessment needs to consider the fact that the way we utilize our recycled water and serve those customers may be changing as potable reuse becomes more viable and regulations roll out. And so that's the greater umbrella that project's existing under. And I'm happy to explain that further next month.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Next slide. All right, so let's dive deep into groundwater since this is a major component of the report. So just an overview of how we use groundwater here in Santa Barbara. We use it conjunctively with our other supplies. And so what that means is we let our groundwater sit in drought storage when our other supplies are plentiful, like surface water. And then in times of drought, as those other supplies dry up, we start pumping our groundwater basins as a drought supply. So We have higher pumping during the drought. The last big effort to pump groundwater was in the most recent drought, and so kind of peaked in like 2015, 2016. It can also be used as an emergency supply during a catastrophic event. So if there were, say, an earthquake that collapsed Tecolote Tunnel or Mission Tunnel that bring our surface water supplies down to the city, groundwater is a local supply that we could pump right here on the coast and have available to our customers, as is desal. Next slide. So this is a map of our groundwater basins, just to kind of orient you a little bit. We have two main basins that we produce water from. So outlined in blue is the Santa Barbara Basin, which we also refer to as Storage Unit 1. It also contains Storage Unit 3, which I'll talk about briefly. You can see them differentiated between the yellow and red dashed lines. The Santa Barbara Basin, or Storage Unit 1, primarily underlies the downtown part of the city of Santa Barbara, and the primary threat in the Santa Barbara Basin is seawater intrusion, which I'll explain more thoroughly in a few minutes. And then up in the foothills and sort of the upper state region of Santa Barbara, you can see outlined in red our Foothill Basin. This is another source of production for us, and the primary threat in that basin is groundwater levels dropping as we pump the basin. And so we're going to explore both of those in more depth here in the next few minutes. Next slide, please. So first, looking at our Foothill Basin, that was the basin that we just saw outlined in red. There are several pumpers in the basin besides the city, one of the larger ones being La Cumbre Mutual Water Company. So we've worked on several projects with them to preserve groundwater supplies in the basin. There's also some small private wells, so we're not the only pumper. The multi-year drought yield estimate for the city, so that's the 10-year drought yield, is just over 8,000 acre feet. That came out of the 2018 USGS modeling study. Again, this is something we want to refine better in this next study that we're working on with USGS. Last year in water year 2021, we were resting our basins after pumping them heavily a couple of years ago, and so we produced no water from the Foothill Basin. We estimate currently that we have about 3,800 acre feet of groundwater available still in the Foothill Basin, should we need to pump it. And currently water levels are at about the same place as they were in the early 90s when we came out of the last drought. And I'll show you some graphs of what that looks like now. Next slide. So what this detailed graph is water surface elevations at several different monitoring wells in the Foothill Basin, going all the way back to 1980. So the various colored squiggly lines that you see on the graph represent the water surface elevations of the groundwater basin. And then down on the bottom, you see the small red and green bars. That's pumping in the basin. And the green is non-city pumping. It's actually La Cumbre Mutual Water Company pumping. And then the red is city pumping. And so you can see that this basin is very responsive to pumping. As pumping increases, you see the water levels drop. And then if you focus on the lower right-hand corner of the graph, from 2017 on, you can see the effects of us resting the basins. And so I guess if you go back even a little further, look at like 2015, 2016, 2017, you see the city was pumping the basins pretty heavily in response to the drought. You see the surface levels drop. And then since then we've turned off the wells, and you can see that they are starting to creep back up. We have seen some recovery in the basin. But if you look back historically, we're really kind of where we were in the early 90s. So we still have a ways to go to recover this basin. We're still estimating it could be another 5 to 10 years, depending on conditions. Unfortunately, we've had pretty dry years, so we're not getting a lot of inflow into the groundwater basins right now. Next slide. So moving on now to our storage unit 1, which if you'll remember is the groundwater basin located mainly under the downtown area. We estimate that our multi-year or 10-year drought yield is just over 16,000 acre feet. Again, that came out of the 2018 USGS study. We also did not produce any groundwater in storage unit 1 in water year 2021 because we're letting our basins recover. We estimate that we have quite a bit of remaining yield in the storage unit 1, 10,250 acre feet. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the issue with this basin isn't water levels. You'll see in a minute that the water levels have recovered quite a bit already. It's seawater intrusion. And so I'm going to show you some graphs on where we're standing with that too, but it looks like we have a few questions or comments. So Chair Young.
Yes, thank you. So when we say a multi-year drought yield, it's not 16,000 acre feet each year, right? For a
Correct,
number
it's
of years.
total,
Total and over how many years?
over 10 years.
Okay. So that's
So
about, okay.
yeah,
But-
so in the annual water supply management report, we basically track our cumulative usage over the last 10 years. And so we subtract it from that 16,000 acre foot number to try to keep tabs on how much water we have remaining in the basin. Again, these aren't numbers that we feel are super well defined right now. So that's why we're going back and doing this other study.
Got it. Thank you.
And Commissioner Keller?
Sorry, that was left from before, sorry.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. Okay, so let's dive deeper into storage unit 1. Let's go on to the next slide. So this is looking again at water surface elevation. As I mentioned earlier, this isn't our biggest concern in the basin, but just to kind of take a look at it, again, focus on the right-hand side of the graph. You can see we did pump the basin in 2015 through 2017 in response to the drought. You saw the water surface elevations drop off a little bit. We've pretty much stopped pumping except for some well maintenance moving forward. And you can see that the levels in these different monitoring wells have jumped right back up. So really water surface elevation isn't our issue, it's seawater intrusion. So let's take a look at that. Next slide, please. Oh, this is another graph of storage unit 1. This is the lower producing zone. So there's 2 layers in storage unit 1, the upper producing zone and the lower zone. And this just shows the same pattern that it dropped off when we were pumping from the basin, but it's recovered pretty quickly. We even have some wells in this basin that have been artesianing over the last year. So surface levels are good. Question, Commissioner Young?
Yeah, do each of our groundwater basins communicate with one another? The upper one?
Where, yeah. So the upper and lower do. But I think the travel time is very slow because we have a lot of clay layers in our basins. And so water traveling amongst the different storage units is a very slow process. And there's similarly a little bit of interconnectivity between Foothill and storage unit 1. But again, we're talking like very slow travel time. Mr. Hagmark, did you have something? Nope, looks like he's good. Okay, so let's look at seawater intrusion. That's more interesting in this basin. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a map to orient you where we're gonna go with this exploration of seawater intrusion. You'll see 3 large red arrows. Each of those arrows points at a monitoring well where we collect chloride levels for the basin. And you can see circled in yellow, that's El Estero Water Resources Center. So just to kind of orient you, you can see the 101 crossing through the middle of the graph. And so what we're gonna do is first look at a well very close to the ocean, and then we're gonna move inland. And then another thing to note is in the upper left-hand corner of this graph, you see some small black triangles. Those are our production wells. That's where we actually pump the water out of the basin. And so the idea is when we pump from that upper left-hand corner of the groundwater basin, we pull seawater inward. And so we're gonna look at these monitoring wells starting at the ocean and moving inland to show you kind of where we're at with seawater intrusion. Next slide. Okay, so this is that first red arrow on the far right, closest to the ocean. And on the graph on the right, you see chloride levels. And so the timing of this graph goes back to 1986. And then our last read was in June 2021. And so the pattern to recognize here was coming out of the last, or that was actually in the heart of the last drought in the mid 80s. You can see that our chloride levels got pretty high. It looks like they were hovering between like 10,000 and even up to 14,000 acre feet. That drought ended, we rested the basin, and you can see that levels dropped back down to, sorry, not acre feet, 6,000 milligrams per liter of chloride. And so what we would like to see as we rest these basins and let the basin recover is those levels to drop back down again. So looking at the current drought from like 2014 onward, you can see that the chloride levels did spike again up to about 10,000 milligrams per liter. They're kind of hovering in that area. And we're waiting for them to drop. Now, again, remember, we're at the monitoring well right now closest to the ocean. So we would expect the biggest swing in chlorides here because that's where the water is coming in right off the coast. So if we move inland on the next slide, Now we're at a monitoring well about halfway between the ocean and the 101. And just to point out here, the y-axis on each of these graphs is the same. So while we were seeing chloride levels at the height of the drought around 10,000 milligrams per liter at the last monitoring well, you can see that they really only spiked in the last drought to about 1,500, 1,700 milligrams per liter at this well. So as we move inland, the chloride levels are not as high, but we did see a spike as we pumped the basin in from 2014 onward. We're also starting to see those start to fall off and go back down closer to zero, which is what we want to see. And moving on inland to the next slide. So this is our final monitoring well that we're going to look like. You see now that we've hopped over the 101 and we're inland closer to our production wells. And what this shows us is that there really wasn't any increase in chloride levels when we pumped the basin in the last drought. And so this is a good thing. It kind of shows the extent of how far the seawater intrusion has moved inland. It's really not close to our production wells at all, but we will continue to monitor each of these wells and watch that slug of seawater move back outward as we rest the basins. Commissioner Young?
Yeah, just a question. Are we considering the possibility of using any excess recycled water to inject into the lower part of this basin to act as a retard against seawater intrusion?
We did study that. That was part of the work that was the potable reuse study that was done. And it did not pencil out. We'd have to put in a lot of wells along the coast. And if you kind of follow the molecules, half of what you inject in the ground will be kind of lost to the ocean, and half you can hope will get sucked up in our wells again, I guess someday. But it didn't pencil out for us. Certainly happy to bring that report back and talk some more about it. But I think there are better uses of that recycled water that we could do going forward.
But I'm not thinking of it in terms of augmenting water supply, but as creating an aquitard against seawater intrusion, such that if we are withdrawing water at these wells, which are the black triangles within the city, that the injection of the recycled water lower down is serving to kind of apply some pressure against the onward migration of seawater. And I mention this because it's being done up in the Monterey Bay area, where they've had significant seawater intrusion coming in miles and miles. And there are a series of wells where water is being injected into the ground to set up this pressure. And it's working.
Chair Young, it does work. I agree, it does work. I do it down in Orange County as well. And the modeling of it actually works as half of it ends up going to the sea and half of it, so that barrier that it creates is basically applying pressure in both directions. And so you basically end up losing molecules of water make their way back to the groundwater wells, and molecules make their way out to the ocean. That's what creates that barrier of pressure. So in the way that the state looks at it, they require that your recycled water be treated to advanced water treatment standards, so potable standards. And then there has to still be a duration of time. But I'm very familiar with what you're talking about in the form of a barrier. But that's how that barrier kind of works. You're putting this water down there, creating kind of a curtain, but the water is flowing out. To create that pressure barrier, you have to pressurize it in such a way that the water is moving both out to sea and inland.
So I guess
to create that barrier.
I guess the problem is that if we had to treat it to that highest level of treatment, then we would just be sending water back out in the ocean, and we're better off trying to use it for direct reuse in some way.
That would be
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. And we didn't put that on here, but I wanted to say our groundwater, depending on where we're taking it from the basin, is somewhere between, I think, in the 60s up to about 150 parts per million. So when you see some of these Sentinel wells having 6,000 parts per million, just giving you in a short period of time, that salinity or chloride drops off pretty quickly. And so We are monitoring it really closely, and you can see how it could be, you could definitely ruin the groundwater basins for decades if we don't manage this properly.
Commissioner Cooney, I saw you had your hand up. Did you have a question?
You know, I did, and then I thought about the answer and kept it to myself.
Okay.
So I was like, wait, no, you know this. Okay, move on.
Okay,
So.
no worries. All right, so next slide. So just a quick mention of our storage unit number 3 groundwater basin. So this is, again, within that overall umbrella of the Santa Barbara Basin. This is a small groundwater basin that has difficult water quality. And so what we've done in the past with this water is actually augmented our recycled water system instead of trying to treat it and put it into the potable system. There are other pumpers in this basin. We estimate that we can get about 200 acre feet per year from storage unit number 3. We haven't used it in a couple of years. So in water year 2021, we didn't use any of this water to supplement the recycled water system. But during the drought, we used it, and it's available if we need it. And that's kind of all I have to say about storage unit 3. Next slide, please. So finally, we've gotten to our recommendation, and that would be that Water Commission recommends that Council approve and adopt the City of Santa Barbara's Water Supply Management Report for the 2021 water year, finding that the groundwater basins are in long-term balance and according with the conjunctive management elements of the city's enhanced urban water management plan. And again, this comes out of our EIR for the use of state water. So we're required to make these findings. Comment or question, Commissioner Young?
Nothing. Do we need a motion for something like this?
We would need a motion, yeah.
Okay, all right. I just have one question going backwards, and that was with respect to La Cumbre Mutual Water District. So they also are using that Foothill Basin.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's not an adjudicated basin, right? It's
no, none of our basins are adjudicated. We do have an agreement with La Cumbre, though, where they're limited to only pumping 300 acre feet per year from the Foothill Basin. And then we've been working with them on several projects to try to help them reduce the amount of groundwater they're pumping from Foothill by using other sources such as state water or water they've purchased from the city, et cetera.
Got it. Okay. Well, that answers the rest of my question.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Okay.
Oh,
Is there, all right. Do we have any questions by from members of the public on this item?
Vice Chair Young, we do not at this time.
Okay. Well, are we ready for a motion then?
I move to approve the recommendation.
Okay, and have it a second.
Second.
Great. All right. Madam Clerk, roll call on the motion.
Yes, Commissioner Keller,
Yes.
Commissioner Kenmeyer is absent, Commissioner Cooney,
Yes.
Chair Davis is absent, and Vice Chair Young.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much for that report. I think I learned something every time we go over these water supply reports in whatever format they come before us. So I do appreciate it. Are we ready for the next agenda item, Mr. Hagmark?
Yes.
Great. Number 7.
All right. Chair Young, commissioners, Water Resources Managers Report today. We try to get this out ahead of time, make it available to you all for any questions you might have. But as you know, we've just started another water year. We've done our best here to try and capture all the major sources, and including we've added to this chart I think the desal, let's see, what do we have in here? The desal water sales agreement. We've got that included.
This is sources, so it doesn't include the agreement, yeah. But
So
in the planned usage, the agreement is included in those numbers.
There we go. So far, we are tracking on target. I don't see any issues there. Maybe I'll just stop here and see, is there any specific questions or slides you'd like me to speak to? Because this content was kind of made to just keep the commission and public informed about what's going on, but I'm happy to elaborate on anything in this report.
I don't have any questions. You could just flip through the report as you normally do.
All right, next slide. Plan versus actual, we're tracking on target. Next slide. We continue to, right, as it stands now, we're actually tracking really close to where our urban water management plan said we would be. We're traveling a little increased usage, but we started to now turn back down with the current water supply situation. The community seems to be responding to that. Next slide. Here I'm going to take an opportunity to talk about where we are. Our residential GPCD continues to look really good. Currently trending around 70 gallons per capita. And I wanted to take this time to highlight the state's current status. So the State Water Resources Control Board is currently working on some emergency water use regulations. Our water conservation staff have been very engaged in that conversation, and there's a lot of new regulations coming down, but of concern to us. And again, the majority of the concern is just how the state goes about rolling this out. But one is they have kind of a strict prohibition on using water to wash off any surfaces, which for the most part, we don't have a problem for, except when it comes to house painting and cleaning. It's typically the method of washing down a house, cleaning off the existing paint, cleaning that up, and before you paint. And right now, the way that the current language is drafted, it would make it really complicated for someone who was planning to paint their house. We haven't dug into this yet, but I would be seeking, input from our attorney's office on whether or not we could make a health and safety findings, because for most people, although paint looks nice, it also serves a purpose in protecting a structure from moisture and mold. And so there are certain benefits to keeping your house painted and preserving that wood or interior, exterior condition of your home. But that was one condition that we noted. The other one that was of concern had to do with the unique space. Most people may or may not know this, but the parkway. So the space in between the curb and the sidewalk, back of sidewalk, I should say, is owned by the city. However, in this mutual interest, we encourage our homeowners to embrace that and maintain that part of the frontage of their property, whether there's a street tree there. And the state is taking kind of a hard line on watering the parkway. And although I agree that it's an inappropriate place for turf, in some ways it's the only way that some of our street trees get watered. And so I think we have some concerns about just a hard stop on that. We've certainly been working in our codes that when people read their landscaping, to think differently about using natives in that space or other landscaping options that don't require extensive watering, but trying to manage that in a careful and thoughtful way such that we preserve street tree infrastructure if there are trees in that parkway space. So the state having just a hard stop on that is a little complicated, and hopefully there'll be a space in there for communication on that with our customers, without getting to having police running around enforcing, water cops, I should say, wandering around trying to enforce that.
And that was my question, Mr. Hagmark. How are state regulations actually enforced within a municipality? Does it rely upon our local staff to then carry that out?
Yeah, and I think that's the expectation, Chair Young, is that the city would be enforcing this and finding or finding customers who are not in compliance. And again, that has been something that I think this community's been really successful at avoiding and still getting, the conservation that we need from this community. And that's one of the challenges with the state's, one size fits all brush. It doesn't take into effect, our urban water management plan that we have, our, the list of water conservation or demand reduction tools that we have that I think are specific to our community. So these kind of things are really frustrating for us. It'd be easier if they just kind of set goals and let us figure out how to achieve those goals, and leave that up to, well, the Water Commission and City Council to know how best to implement that.
So at our level, do we leave that up just to the police, or do we have quote unquote water cops that go around looking for violations?
Yeah, in the past, Chair Young, we've used typically our water conservation team. And we've even at times brought on some hourly folks, but it is complicated. We have a good relationship with the community, a positive relationship with the community. And so to basically swear them in as officers that can fine, it just kind of changes that relationship. And I don't know that it's all that productive. But that has, when we did in the 90s, I think there was a short time when we had people patrolling and providing tickets for watering turf, grass. I hope we don't get there. I know that it hasn't been a productive relationship with the community, nor is it something we're really staffed up to handle. Right. Certainly our law enforcement police officers have their hands full with enforcing other rules, so we would not be asking them to be part of that.
Thank you.
Next slide. We just have a few slides in here. You can flip through these, just projecting out. These are NOAA's latest projections, which continue to show below average rainfall for our area for the remainder of the winter. However, at this point with climate change, they really don't have a good grasp on these short-term weather patterns. This recent rainfall, has put, got about 6 inches of rain up at Gibraltar, which was fantastic. The reservoir, last I looked, had come up about a foot, which tells me that we're kind of getting to that saturation point in the backcountry. Usually we need to get about 12 inches of rain before we start to see continuous runoff. So yeah, I think we're right around 10 inches of rain right now. So we're really close. I think if we continue, the storm comes in next week, really looking very positive, because once you kind of hit that threshold, we'll get a 2-inch rain event and the reservoir will come up several feet. But up until then, it's usually kind of comes up just a few inches, even if you do have a major rain event. So we're getting to that point, which is exciting. Just tracking our water usage as it compares to the latest drought cycle. We've kind of going up and down here. I would distinguish, it's really kind of interesting. I was looking at this graphic here. I'm not sure if my cursor shows up, but the difference between where we are at this green line here, which is our present reservoir elevation, and the dotted line, which is based on kind of historically where it would have been. That difference right there is pretty much the city's carryover water. If you were to go in and take out the 20,000 acre feet of city carryover water, the reservoir would be at that elevation. So, and I'll just say that that is the product of the city running desal, our efforts in water conservation that are making the difference in Cachuma right now. Everybody else, all of our neighboring agencies are all tracking pretty much normal use of Cachuma. They don't have a lot of carryover. So they're using basically all the allocations they get from Cachuma. So it's making a difference. And in this graphic, you can kind of point out how what it looks like for the lake. Next slide. Recycled water production. Ms. Corey just presented this graphic. Again, if I was to tell a story here with this, it's just that we have a lot of capacity. This is one of the challenges with recycled water, and kind of one of the significant improvements from the potable reuse option is there's just not a lot of demand for recycled water in the winter months. And so we have this multi-million-dollar facility sitting there with the capability of producing 3 million gallons of water a day, and it's there's just no demand for it. So look forward to finding ways to better utilize this, but I think ultimately at the end of the day, the demand really lies in the potable water demand. And so trying to get this water to that level is kind of the key if you want to maximize its use. Next slide. Just recycle water program. We did have some maintenance work that was done over the summer, but so far it's been producing great. We do have a project that we'll be starting construction on shortly, and that's to replace the recycled water pumps, which will again improve the reliability of this recycled water system. Next slide. Continue to see historically low wastewater coming into the plant, down at 5.6 MGD coming into the facility. And to remind those who haven't been around for a while, is in 2010, we were treating on average 8 million gallons a day. So 2 million gallons a day less wastewater is coming into our wastewater treatment plant. It's just quite incredible. I do remind people that we're still getting the same amount of solids, just a whole lot less water that comes with it, which complicates maintenance of the collection system. But needless to say, this is the right direction for our community. Next slide. So in here we have a lot of information about our our sewer lateral inspection program. What I'd like to point out here for 2021, we've had 9 public spills, and we've had, and this is reported, we've had 25 public spills, or I should say private lateral spills, and we've had 9 public sewer system spills. So we have seen an increase this year. I will admit a big portion of that is just we've had a difficult time staying staffed in our collections group. It's a rough economy out there right now. I know you're talking to constituents, but it's just hard to find people. We've had a lot of turnover in that group, and particularly it's been difficult to stay on top of the maintenance there. So we can tell the difference. But we're continuing to look at how we can improve our operations. We're trying to leverage more contract work, but that too, the contract community is also hit hard by it and having difficulty finding good people to work. But Chair Young.
Yeah, Mr. Hagmark, and the 9 public spills, what was the source for those spills? Blockages of tree roots or stuff like that, or something else?
Yeah, miscellaneous. I think a lot of them, we had some odd debris that got in. We had in 3 cases, we had a failed liner. So as you may recall, we go through and line our sewer mains, and the recent contract, for whatever reason, we're still investigating that with the contractor. The liner has kind of come unraveled and in itself caused a blockage. So I don't have any more details from you at this point, but we're investigating that and trying to get to the bottom of what happened. Was it a workmanship issue, a product warranty issue? But that was unusual this year. The majority of our blocks, though, are usually roots. And that just means we need to stay on top of the cleaning and replacement of the pipe, because if you have roots getting in there, typically means the pipe has kind of reached the end of its useful life.
So do we get roots into lined pipe? Are the roots able to get into the plastic pipe?
Once you seal it off, I get this question all the time because private property owners would say, "Oh, it's your city street tree that's ruined my lateral," and I'm like, well, technically the roots got into your lateral because your pipe joints are done. Your 60-year-old clay pipe has mortar joints and they only last for so long. So if you have a pipe that is in good shape, roots can't get in it. that's at the end of the day. And so when we find these roots getting in, whether that's from a private lateral and then getting into the public main, it's because the pipe has reached the end of its useful life. And when we line it, there are no joints. We just have the lateral penetrations that we have to keep a careful eye on, but it stops roots from getting in. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Next slide. So these here are just how many cases we have currently operating with this SLIP program. I will just briefly summarize that this program modeled after water conservation. We're here to help the community. This is an asset that's privately owned, certainly has an impact on the community as a whole if those laterals are not maintained, but really trying to educate and then provide resources to homeowners if they have a lateral that's in failing condition. These can be major costs. It's on par with replacing a roof, anywhere from $3,000 to over $10,000, depending on how complicated your private lateral is. But we've certainly seen as our community continues, our laterals continue to age. The drier the conditions, those tree roots get more aggressive and getting in and causing problems. And so really trying to position ourselves to be here as a resource for the community to address these growing issues. Next slide. Just tracking how many letters are going out, how many homeowners we're working with. Next slide. What type of repair options the community seems to be going with. Option one is typically when the homeowner hires their own contractor. And then option two is that's the new option that we've added. The city has gone out to bid and selected a contractor. And so a resident, we call this the white glove service. They can come in and just pay a fee and the city will manage a contractor to replace their lateral connection. And then option threes are, this is a growing market, but it's replacing your lateral with trenchless technology. All right, next slide. Just tracking our communication with our property owners. Next slide. And then here we continue to track COVID RNA in our wastewater. As you can see, it remains relatively low. We haven't seen any major spikes. We aren't currently looking at the various strains of Omicron and Delta, but I know that has been something the feds have been interested in having the labs do. So we'll happy to participate in that. We really hope this data is going to be valuable, a few years from now when, scientists have a chance to look back and really look at this data and how it corresponds to the actual infections that we've seen in the community. And then of course, with how the impacts of getting vaccinated. So this is really, I think, more of an academic event that, because we do see this for the next pandemic, for the other, diseases that continue to plague our communities. This could really be a powerful tool in predicting the severity of these events. So I think this is time well spent tracking this information. And right now we are taking these samples weekly and sending them off to a lab to have them tested. So with that, that was our final slide. I don't know if there's any other questions or concerns. I'm happy to.
I have just one quick question about this slide. Do we happen to know what the vaccination rate is within the city of Santa Barbara for COVID?
I believe that number's out there. I do not know that number, but I believe public health is tracking that.
Okay.
I think public health has it for the county. I haven't seen anything for the city itself, but yeah.
It would be interesting to see, certainly back in last year, those are pretty high numbers.
Yeah.
And the vaccination rate obviously was much lower than it is now. So it actually goes to show the benefit of vaccination.
Yeah.
Just by this graph.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Hagmark.
Absolutely. Commissioner Cooney, you had a question?
Too. And I'm sorry if this isn't exactly like within the purview of the Water Commission, but I do, this is like a constant concern sort of for me. When you talk about, you know, turnover, having trouble staffing or whatever, right? So we have like a long-term plan for, you know, drought or, you know, lack of water or whatever, but, and I know there's not a simple answer to this, but is there a long-term plan for retaining staff as housing costs rise in the city of Santa Barbara? You know, like we want to keep people around that are skilled and experienced, right? I mean, you can tell me if I'm talking crazy, but I don't see this magically, you know, in 10 years it being cheaper to live here, right? So is there anything the city or the commission or whatever can do other than obviously just like pay people a large amount, but that isn't always easy for a lot of reasons.
Well, I really appreciate that question, Commissioner Cooney, and we have, I know my team, we're constantly talking at Santa Barbara City College to folks trying to figure out what they want to do with their career. We've been talking at UCSB and trying to get the word out there, and I think that's probably the best. And before the pandemic, we were actually doing quite a bit with the high school, trying to create a channel for people who, you know, didn't want to go to college. The challenge is we'd like to get them in, and then we want them to still keep going to school. I think that's the key, because everything we do right now is so technical. I mean, it's just growing more and more technical. We don't need someone who's just wants to dig a trench. Like that job is certainly, that may be part of a job, but we also need them to bust out an iPad. They need to understand asset management and GIS and all these other features. So I think it's really trying to figure out, when we've had more luck with this, we have an operator and training program in which we're really going after people in the community to try and have a connection to this community, have family that live here, friends that live here. So they're really motivated to stay and really try to get them in the door, expose them, and hopefully continue to support them to seek higher education at the Santa Barbara City College or, you know, Ventura College, and then also to reach for these certifications that I think also kind of elevate their knowledge and understanding. So it is a challenging time. I don't believe we'll ever be able to provide the housing that will be necessary to house our workforce. I do think we need to be working on trying to house at least some emergency response, because we've lost a lot of those folks who used to be able to, you know, at 2 a.m, wake up and respond to a water main. Now they're all into Oxnard or Lompoc, Buellton area. So how do we get those people back in town? And so I think there may be some different approaches. Maybe we need to have housing just for that. That's kind of the trade-off. We provide some side subsidized housing for that kind of emergency response, so they can have their family and live here. But yeah, it's a complicated one. And you know, my ask to the commission is continue to talk with people. If you find someone bright and interested and really wants to stay here, send them my way. Love talking to people about a job in the water field. It's exciting. It's great. You know, I think there's a lot of value, personal value I get from providing such a core service to this community. So I think that would be really helpful.
For sure.
So Councilmember Snedden, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick question, and then I guess a couple comments, if that's okay. But the question's about the recycled water, and I know we talk about this a lot, and there's not a demand for it in the winter time, but there would be a demand in the summer. And if there's just a way to keep thinking about that, our parks could use this water in the summer in some way. And I know this has been an ongoing topic, but I just want to keep it going, the conversation. So that's just one question about, you know, options in there. And then the other is, so you talked about being, you know, multi-million-dollar facility. And if we go to potable, reuse, is that a incremental step in that, or does that part just become scrapped and no longer useful and it just goes a different route for potable? Or is it a loss? Yeah.
So Councilmember Stan, that's great questions. The first one, I don't know if you caught that, but Ms. Corey is going to be coming back next month to talk about a market study for recycled water. So we're going to keep that conversation going, keep it alive. And then Commissioner Keller has a graduate student who's been working on the future of DPR. And so we wanted to, he's working on a study there. And we wanted to kind of bring him back to the commission and just talk about what they have learned and where the technology gaps are in making DPR a reality. So we're still trying to figure out the timing of when's a good month to bring them back and have that conversation. But yeah, we plan on keeping that alive. And then, shoot, your last question. I'm sorry.
So once the recycled water, if we go to potable,
oh yes,
yeah.
Yeah. So good question. And I don't know that I have the full answer to this. We will need that pre-treatment there. I hope, because we chose a very flexible design with that facility, that we may be able to utilize that. Maybe we have to move it across the street to the future home of potable reuse, but that we'll be able to utilize the majority of that equipment, because you do need to have that pre-screening material. That's the tertiary water. I think it's just going to be additional layers added onto that. It'd just be whether or not that facility and its concurrent components, when we go to do it, is still the appropriate choice. But good point. That's a good question.
And so then when we do come back, or when you come back next month, or whenever the recycled water comes back, really specifically looking at if there's a way for us to get that water to our parks. That's just such an ongoing issue that I think it might not be cost effective, or it might not turn out in the analysis, but if we could just really specifically look at that, if we could get that going, I don't know, or something in the consideration. Yeah.
No, it's a great one. And I've actually just got a question from Nick Welsh about that. He was asking about De La Guerra Plaza in particular.
Exactly.
So my response to him is the closest recycled water connection right now is at the high school, middle school. We provide those parks, or there's outside landscaping with recycled water. So to get it over to De La Guerra Plaza was somewhere between $750,000 to $1 million in infrastructure that would have to be put in. And, you know, just looking at De La Guerra Plaza, if you were to put it all in grass, which is not what we would do anyway, but if you were to put it all in grass, you're maybe talking maybe $3,000 to $5,000 in water every year. So it's a hard sell to spend $1 million to deliver, you know, offset what is a very small amount of water there. But the idea, and what Ms. Corey is going to be looking at as part of the study, is maybe there's a bunch of stuff along the way we could connect, and then that makes the benefit pay off. But that's going to be the interesting part of the study. We've looked at these spaces and what parks remain. We've gotten by far the majority of city parks are receive recycled water, and so now it comes down to, you know, these little outliers and how do you get water to them. But I think the great question that will also come out of this is that where we want to spend our infrastructure, you know, in kind of subsidizing some of this landscaping? And I think that's going to be a good conversation, because at the end of the day, what we're finding from parks, we had this good conversation, is parks doesn't have the money for water anyway. So even when we find we get recycled water there, they're not using it because they can't afford it. So it's a good conversation, you know, and I have this great story. At one point when we were finishing up design of the recycled water plant, I had reached out to Jill and said, hey, Jill, I need you guys to help us put the recycled water plant so its paces. We want to make sure that its production numbers are right. And I said, I'll give you free water at the golf course. And she's like, well, I'm only going to take that if you pay for the extra landscaping service. I got to mow more. I got to do all these other things. So I'm like, oh boy, like, okay, never mind.
Yeah, but never mind, because
Yeah.
I don't mean to wag my finger, sorry, but it's this siloed thing. I mean, maybe it's in the city's interest that
Yes.
that water is going to the golf course, and between these two departments, maybe it needs to be a bigger conversation. That's what I mean. Might not pencil out exactly, but it might be in the city's interest to spend $6,000 a year to have recycled water watering certain areas. So I think let's keep it in the
Conversation.
analysis and the conversation. And the other is what it would take infrastructure wise to get Peabody Charter School watered on actual recycled reclaimed water instead of just being billed that way, but actually using potable water. So and I think it's fairly close to a purple line, and we can talk more about that too. But I think trucks, if you can truck the water for watering, and we can save this discussion, but I wouldn't put too much into infrastructure to be watering De La Guerra Plaza, because we're going a whole different direction with the design of that for the update. So
Yeah.
I don't know that I would do that there, but there are places, and I think we need to look at it holistically and not just that there isn't money for maintenance for the landscaping, so forget about the recycled water. I don't think that's a very satisfactory, I don't think it's very,
Yeah, we'll do our best in this study. This is great feedback. This is exactly the kind of feedback we were planning for next month, but it'll get us rolling. But I think this is a good conversation, and you're right. It may go beyond just the specific water issues, and we'll do our best to try and bring in the parks conversation, and maybe we, as part of the study, want to reach out to the Parks Commission and talk with them particularly about this. Maybe they want to weigh in, because this is there's the right thing to do, which the city has in many ways done the right thing rather than what's usually the most affordable or cost benefit. So we've done that a lot. I mean, in the past. So not to say that we can revisit all those conversations.
I appreciate that. And I think maybe going to the Parks Commission is a worthwhile conversation to keep having. So then, yeah, those were my questions. But I just, this end of year presentation, and you both go through it so, factually and the data, and it's really, I don't want to get lost what an astonishing achievement it is every year, the careful management of our water supply and the balancing and the accounting of every drop of water. And it just, every time, the confidence that you are tracking very carefully the groundwater basins and all of the balancing. And I just really appreciate that. And then just mentioning the staffing issues, if we need to take a deeper look at that too. But I just want to take this opportunity to say really what heroes the water department in particular has been during COVID times. And it's easy for us now with vaccinations and, looking at this last chart here too, to be thinking about, that during that big spike, we didn't know what was going on, and members of your staff showed up every day and managed emergencies, and were really heroes through this. And it's not to be understated. It's really, really so much appreciation for that, and just wanted to take that time to say that. Oh, and also always an open invitation. People have come to my class before, I know, and sort of recruited, and I think my students didn't understand that there were such high paying jobs with opportunities in the future. And it's an open invitation to always come back. And I know Trace has come to our sort of geology department mixers and has really he's a former student, so it's a good connection, and we'll just keeping that going. But always welcome to come, and the students really love hearing about all of these things. So thank you.
Thank you for your kind words, and we welcome invitations. We will make someone available to come speak. We love those opportunities to connect. It's really great.
Thank you.
So, are we at the end of our meeting?
We're at the end,
Okay.
Chair Young.
Great. Well, I just wanted to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and a safe and Happy New Year. And to thank everybody for all their efforts, both the commission members and staff for doing such a great job. And we will reconvene on January 20th of next year.
Absolutely.
Happy
Thank you all.
holidays.
Happy holidays. Bye-bye.